There is a name buried inside the priesthood of Israel that most Bible readers have walked past their entire lives without stopping to ask what it means. It is the name of one of the most celebrated priests in all of the Old Testament. A man so zealous for God that he single-handedly stopped a plague that was killing thousands of Israelites. A man to whom God personally gave a covenant of peace and an everlasting priesthood. A man whose descendants served as priests in Israel for generations. And his name, in the Egyptian language, means the Nubian, the dark-skinned one, the African. His name is Phinehas. And once you understand what that name means and where it comes from, you will never read the book of Numbers the same way again.
Welcome back to Forgotten Tribes and Scrolls. Today we open the scroll on Phinehas, a priest whose story is one of the most dramatic and theologically significant moments in the entire wilderness narrative of Israel. Most people who have heard of him remember one moment, the spear. But there is so much more to his story than that one act, and his name alone opens up a conversation about the African presence woven into the very priesthood of Israel. Let's get into it.
Before we get into what Phinehas did, we need to stop at his name, because his name is the foundation of everything. Phinehas. In the Egyptian language, and scholars of ancient Egyptian linguistics are in broad agreement on this, the name Phinehas derives from the Egyptian term meaning the Nubian, or the dark-skinned one. The same root gives us the name of the biblical character Phinehas and appears in various forms across ancient Egyptian records referring specifically to people of Nubian or sub-Saharan African origin. Now, why would an Israelite priest have an Egyptian name meaning the Nubian? Think about the context. Israel has just spent 400 years in Egypt. 400 years of living, working, building, and existing within Egyptian culture and society. Intermarriage happened. Cultural exchange happened. Names traveled across ethnic lines. And the presence of an Egyptian name, meaning the African, inside the Israelite priesthood tells us something significant about the complexity and diversity of the people who came out of Egypt and became Israel. Phinehas was not an outsider. He was not a foreigner. He was an Israelite priest, the grandson of Aaron himself, and he carried an African name.
Exodus chapter 6, verse 25. Almost easy to miss. Eleazar, son of Aaron, took one of the daughters of Putiel as his wife, and she bore him Phinehas. That is the introduction. Phinehas is the grandson of Aaron the high priest, the great-nephew of Moses, born inside the most sacred priestly family in all of Israel. His father, Eleazar, would eventually succeed Aaron as high priest, and Phinehas himself would become one of the most significant priestly figures in the entire Old Testament. His lineage placed him at the absolute center of Israelite worship. His family carried the ark. His family performed the sacrifices. His family maintained the tabernacle. And he carried an Egyptian name, meaning the Nubian, into every one of those sacred responsibilities.
Numbers chapter 25. Israel is camped at Shittim, and the people begin to commit sexual immorality with the Moabite and Midianite women. They are invited to the sacrifices of foreign gods. They bow down before them, and God's anger burns against Israel. A plague begins. People are dying. Moses is weeping at the entrance of the tabernacle. The leaders are gathered. And in the middle of this national crisis, an Israelite man brazenly walks past the weeping congregation and brings a Midianite woman into his tent in full view of Moses and the entire assembly. The text describes it with a kind of slow-motion horror. Everyone can see what is happening. And nobody moves. Until Phinehas does. He takes a spear, he follows the man into the tent, and he drives the spear through both of them. The plague stops immediately. 24,000 people had already died. the moment Phinehas acted, it stopped. God speaks to Moses and says, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites. He was zealous for my honor among them. Therefore, tell him, I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood because he was zealous for the honor of his God.
Stop and sit with what God just gave Phinehas. A covenant, a personal covenant directly from God. The same kind of covenant language used with Abraham, with David, with Noah. God is making a binding, eternal agreement with this one man because of his zeal. And the content of the covenant is extraordinary. A covenant of peace and a lasting priesthood for him and his descendants forever. This is not a small reward for good behavior. This is God looking at the act of Phinehas and saying, this man's commitment to my honor is so absolute that I am going to write his name into the eternal priestly order of Israel. And it was honored. Phinehas goes on to serve as a military leader in Israel's campaigns. He is consulted as a priest and oracle at critical moments in Israelite history. In the book of Judges, he appears as the functioning high priest of Israel. In Psalm 106, verse 30, the psalmist looks back at that moment with the spear and says, Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was checked. And this was credited to him as righteousness for endless generations to come. Credited to him as righteousness. The same language used of Abraham's faith in Genesis 15. Zealous for the honor of his God.
Here is what I want you to carry away from this episode. The priesthood of Israel, the most sacred institution in the entire Old Testament, had a man at its center whose name in Egyptian meant the African, the Nubian, the dark-skinned one. He was not on the margins of Israelite worship. He was in the inner circle, the grandson of the first high priest, the recipient of a personal covenant from God, a man whose righteousness is compared to Abraham's faith. And his name, the name his parents gave him, pointed back to Africa, to Nubia, to the dark-skinned people south of Egypt. We do not know exactly why his parents gave him that name. Perhaps there was African blood in the family line. Perhaps it was a cultural name carried over from 400 years in Egypt. Perhaps it was something else entirely. But we know the name. We know what it means. And we know that God looked at the man who carried that name and said, I am making a covenant with him, an everlasting priesthood for him and his descendants forever. Phinehas stood up when everyone else sat down. He acted when everyone else hesitated. He was zealous for the honor of God in a moment when the entire nation had gone quiet. And God rewarded that zeal with a covenant that outlasted his lifetime and shaped the priesthood of Israel for generations. His name meant the Nubian, the African, and he carried that name into the holiest spaces in all of Israel, into the tabernacle, into the priesthood, into the eternal record of Scripture. The African name was always inside the priesthood of Israel. We were just never taught to see it there.
If this episode opened your eyes, share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe to Forgotten Tribes and Scrolls. Next episode, we go into Simon of Cyrene, the North African man who carried the cross of Jesus to Calvary, and what the details Mark gives us about his family suggest about the African presence in the earliest Christian community. See you there.